You're watching Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. I'm Also Young. Now, as the year draws to a close, we highlight important issues affecting South Korea. Today, its relations with Japan and China, its closest neighbours in East Asia. Relations between the countries have long been marred by historical issues and territorial disputes after Japan's colonisation of Korea and invasion of China in the early 20th century. Attempts to build bridges has always been dependent on political leadership. Three-way summits, free trade talks and other initiatives, they've been stalled over the stretch of the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the ongoing U.S. China rivalry. We discussed today whether there is hope of reigniting efforts for peace and cooperation in Northeast Asia. For this, we are joined by Jin Kai, non-resident scholar at the Sigur Center for Asian Studies at George Washington University, and Alexis Dudden, professor of history at the University of Connecticut. Thank you both so much for joining us today. And, well, my first question goes to you, Professor Jin. Now, we've seen various attempts at building cooperation here in Northeast Asia, but they've mostly fallen through. And why has there been such a lack of progress on these regional initiatives and attempts at cooperation between South Korea, China and Japan?
Well, this is almost at a philosophical level of questioning. I mean, put the historical and the structural perspective, like the historical dispute and the U.S. influence as an external factor, put them away. I think what these three countries need to do to improve their relations is to take each other's security concerns more seriously than to just to take other security aspirations merely as troubles, if not threats. But we are still far from being from there, and not because we are incapable of doing that, but because of the bitter geopolitical reality in which countries tend to put their respective interests first. And that they are pretty aware that a foundation of the greater consensus among the regional countries and their reciprocal compromise by all the countries are very important for the future reconciliation, but we are still far from there. And well, this is what's happening right now. So a rapid rise in China, in many scenarios, it could be regarded as challenging, not a threat. Japan, however, increasingly has turned to so-called right, and especially its defense budget has just been doubled. And this is, in my personal view, this is a very extremely significant change since decades ago. And South Korea maybe, still find itself unable to escape from this geopolitical complexity. So we are a little bit far from what we expect, but I still hope for it in the future.
Right. Of course, Japan increasing its defense budget would indeed worry its neighbors, which are, South Koreans and Chinese. We are pretty still scarred by the brutal practices of Imperial Japan during its colonization of Korea, and of course we remember the attacks, very brutal attacks on Chinese cities like Nanjing. And well, Professor Dudden, South Korea and Japan, as they try to move forward though and try to cooperate more on more practical interests, I suppose, they always talk about having a relationship that's future oriented, but they seem to get stuck on historical issues, of course. And well, how important is it that these historical disputes are resolved first? And what would you say should be the approach to resolving these issues?
I wish I had the answer to the question. I have been grading my students' exams, and all I can say is history matters, and history matters a lot, except not today because of World Cup. And I would ask us to think about what World Cup was today. I am thinking about 2002, Japan, Korea. I was living in Tokyo. It was the best moment in Korea-Japan relations recently. And all of a sudden, I was thinking about that so much today with Messi and Mbappe. And these are, this is the future. The future is the planet. Your show just recently aired something about a new exhibition about history in a museum in South Korea. 1919, 1948, most people don't care about history as such, and then they want to know where they come from. And I will be really brief. History matters a lot, and Japan needs to own up on what the United Nations has declared war crimes, not just the UNESCO issues, but my question for everybody in the audience is, yeah, we want everyone to get along. Why does Japan keep having to throw the territorial dispute into the mix? Because the Dokdo issue is not cool.
Yes, and while South Korea and China, of course, they were hoping for more acknowledgement of things that happened during Imperial Japan's colonization and its invasion period during the early 20th century. But, well, South Korea and China, they were, of course, engaged in war in the mid-20th century, in the Korean War. And this question goes to both of you, but I'll ask Professor Jin first. Now, South Korea and China, they weren't signatories of the San Francisco Treaty, which was signed between the Allied powers and Japan to really settle its, hostile actions and invasions during the Second World War. So how has this really affected relations between South Korea, Beijing, and Tokyo to this day?
Well, yes, China and South Korea were not signatories of the San Francisco Treaty, or more specifically, the Treaty of Peace with Japan. So to put it simply, both China and South Korea did not sign that treaty for similar reasons, in my personal view. As we know, the question of which government is the only legitimate government in that time, I mean, shortly after World War II, in the Korean Peninsula and across the Taiwan Strait. But by its very natural, I think signing that treaty was a unilateral and one-sided reconciliation, largely between the United States and Japan. And the United States insisted to push it for, obvious geopolitical and ideological considerations. And I guess the history of the following Cold War has actually proved it. And it also seems to me that the significance of this issue that China and South Korea did not sign that treaty in 1952, it proves the extremely complicated nature of Northeast Asia historical issues, especially when it comes to the invasion of imperialist Japan. Even South Korea and China respectively signed bilateral treaties with Japan in 1965 and 1972. Some territory disputes left by the 1952 treaty's ambiguous treatment still remain. For example, the Dokdo Island and Diaoyu Island. So very interestingly, it seems to me that China and South Korea may still share some kind of empathy when it comes to the historical dispute with Japan. And that is one of the most significant issue or sometimes problem for the total reconciliation among these three countries. That's my personal review. Thank you.
I see, and I know you have some views on this too, Professor Dudden. So what are your thoughts on this, the impact of the San Francisco Treaty to this day?
I completely agree. The ambiguity of the San Francisco Treaty is the problem, and the responsibility of the United States. Dokdo, the Senkaku Diaoyu-dai, but especially Dokdo for Korea's issues, this is on the United States. And, it is an ambiguously written treaty for the purpose of being ambiguous, which, one could take a United States party line and say, well, that was okay at the time. Right now, it's not okay, because these little rocks, and there are really important books, articles being written about these rocks, Sankaku, Diaoyutai, Dokdo, Takeshima, worse, Kuriles, northern territories, that show that these do not need to lead to major confrontation. And we're talking about scary stuff. So all I'm saying is it's on the United States government right now to be clear about the rock in the water between Korea and Japan. I completely agree with my colleague.
Professor Dudden, well, we've seen this rivalry between Washington and Beijing continuing to intensify. And as long as the US and China remain in conflict, is it possible to resolve this so-called Asia paradox? Or do you think the resolve to boost trilateral relations in this part of the world is losing relevance now?
It's excellent question. I think the word trilateral is the tricky problem. I have noticed in recent weeks with calls on colleagues at the State Department and other venues in DC, trilateral now might mean something other than Japan and South Korea and the United States, which is really strange because South Korea is equal to Japan as the best partner to the United States. And so it is really, it's discomforting. I think it's on Washington to figure out what it wants, and I'm not sure what Washington wants.
Well, Professor Jin, do you think there's any room for South Korea to promote better relations between Beijing and Washington?
Pardon? Is it?
Oh, sorry. Do you think there's any room for South Korea to promote better relations between China and the US?
Oh, yes, in theory, definitely. And I always believed a more self-dependent South Korea will be able to play a more active and important role in regional issues, including its bilateral relations with China and the United States. But the biggest challenge in my personal view is the inevitable liability or probably responsibility brought by the ROC-US alliance, no matter how important or crucial this alliance has been for South Korea. So in the trilateral relations among South Korea and the other two major powers, China and the United States, the what I describe the tilted scale, not balanced scale, is more likely to intensify the competition between the other two major powers. So by more self-dependent, I mean, the U.S. military force in South Korea ultimately represent and protect the interests of the Americans, not necessarily the South Koreans. Ultimately. So a more self-dependent South Korea, like for example, the national image of South Korea as a world-class technological power in semiconductor industry, I would expect that this image could win more respect from both Beijing and Washington. And I think Israel could be a good, maybe not good, a very interesting case or example in some aspect, because of course these two countries are very different, but at least regarding a more self-dependent national defense policy or maybe methodology, I guess Israel and South Korea could make a very interesting comparative study case if we have spent some time in the future and find out what can get in the future. Anyway, thank you.
I see. And Professor Dudden, well, you've mentioned before that the rise of China as a superpower is pretty unprecedented. There's no example like in history. There's some comparisons like perhaps the US or Japan, but they're not perfect examples. And how do you think the continued leadership of President Xi Jinping will really affect China's relations with the US? Do you see China continuing to build its own sort of world order, or do you think there can be some room for cooperation or some kind of reconciliation between the two countries?
I think that is the most brilliant question, because I agree with my colleague very much. This is a very difficult moment, and what is important to understand is the United States does not need a confrontation with China. That would be idiotic, and I'm not even sure that's the word I'm allowed to use. The United States and China cannot go to war. They can't. The United States and China need to learn how to partner, and what is tricky is both countries, okay, like, I don't mean to be stupid, but let's look at World Cup today. You've got Messi and Mbappe, the two best players in the world. They happen to play on separate national leagues. They play at the same time on the same professional league in Paris. And okay, one of them won, but it's like, let's think about this as actual soccer. Okay, one team is going to have a better economy, but you cannot go to a fighting war between these countries because the world will be devastated. Soccer is the world's game. The world is the world's game. It's just part of me that I look at all of the other countries in this, particularly Korea, particularly Japan. They can't be lost in the great powers that have the capacity to end life as we know it on the planet, which, yeah, I do think about. But yeah, China, United States get along, Korea, Japan will get along, North and South.
So hopefully there can be room for two dragons on the same mountain. But this is where we'll have to end the discussion today. That was Jing Kai, non-resident scholar of Sigur Center for Asian Studies and at George Washington University, and Alexis Dudden, professor of history at the University of Connecticut. Thank you both so much for your time today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you also to our viewers for tuning in. Global Insight will be back Tuesday, South Korea time, 9:30 a.m. Do tune in then. Have a great day. Bye.